The most beloved of creation in God's sight is the one who is best, most beautiful in conduct towards God's dependents. The Prophet goes to this Jewish boy and his father lets him in and he sits by his bed, and now he says to him, قُلْ لَا إِلَهَ إِلَّا اللَّهِ. Will you not testify that there is no God except God alone, except Allah? And Allah in Arabic literally means that, the God, al-ilah, God with a capital G. God, Elohim, Elai, lama sabakhtani. Allah. Say there is no God except God, except Allah, and that I am His messenger. You know it. You've sat with me, you have heard, and you have known in your heart. Don't leave this world without submitting to, without professing to the truth that has become clear to you in your heart. Testify to it, it will be what you need when you stand before God. And the boy, we're told, looks towards his father. He's still a child. He looks towards his father, and his father says, knowing this is the last action his son will ever do, he says, Ati' Abul Qasim. Listen to him. Listen to Muhammad, the father of Al-Qasim, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And he does. And the boy says, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. I testify that there is no God except Allah, that Muhammad is his messenger. And he dies. And he leaves the world in that state. And the Prophet of God comes out and he says, Naja, a soul that has returned to its Lord and is saved. Jihad is not about forcing people to believe. Syria remained a majority non-Muslim country for up to 400 years. In 400 years, nobody felt the need to force anyone to leave Christianity, leave their traditions and their practices and become Muslim. But eventually people convert, and people experience, and people decide that this, if they make that decision, then they make their journey. Islam does not recognize or allow for the imposition of or the use of force in matters which relate to God. Now, I just wanted to end really because I am conscious that there may be questions. Are there questions? Perhaps, so you can have a think about that. Whilst you're thinking about questions, I wanted to just let you know a couple of things. Now, we've seen this video was good. It reminds me of some of the... I'm a prison imam sometimes during the day when I'm not coming to Lincoln to speak to students. So, and of course we have to deal a lot with people who... We have jihad, and you know what? Where do we learn about jihad? Do we learn about it from the Quran and from the Sunnah? The Sunnah, the collected works of the lives and times of Muhammad, Messenger of God, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Do we learn about jihad from him, from God, from the Prophet, from classical scholarship, or do we learn about jihad off a YouTube video? Because you can learn your religion online. Sheikh Google and Maulana YouTube, and so these are, and then there's Allama Facebook. So how do we learn about our religion? Which are the seminaries, the seats of learning? And obviously not to take a dig at you guys, but this generation of young people, you're all young. I'm young. I hope I can still say that. Are notoriously lazy. You only swap for exams most of the time, right? Not you. You guys are in Lincoln, but I'm talking about. I come from Leicester. People are lazy in Leicester. People only swap for exams, and it's very sort of just enough to get by. And that when you do that with your religion, then you know that when you have only learned something for the exams, by the end of the week, you sat the exams, by the end of the week, you've forgotten 80% of it. Is that not true? It's like in through one ear and out through the other. Well, if you do your religion like that, if you sort of just pick up stuff on the go, on the fly, right? This is like a drive-through religion, Islam course. Then all you're left with at the end of it is not a very appetizing or nutritious Big Mac, right? A religious Big Mac. And what that means, of course, I'm not hungry, so Isoc members, don't worry, I've got to catch a train. What it means is people take shortcuts in religion. Why is the idea of violence, of extremism, attractive to some young people. Well, actually, that's not about being Muslim or not Muslim, is it really? Just the extent of violence that exists in today's world tells us that there's something very wrong with the world as it is. There's something very wrong with young people who self-harm and post that online and share that. There's something very wrong with a society where young people go in with weapons into places of education and take down their classmates and their teachers. There's something wrong with the world where people abuse younger people, young people abusing even younger people and abusing animals and inflicting cruelty. There's something wrong with the world where men beat up women. There's something wrong with the world when we are the children of Adam, and yet the same mistakes that the first two sons of Adam made are repeated again and again and again throughout our experience in life. So that happens. But is there a religious justification? Well, it's very frustrating if you turn on the news and you see what looks like a world of atrocities being brought to bear on people you identify with for a religious reason. They don't necessarily speak the same language as you. The people of Fallujah don't speak Punjabi. The people of Afghanistan don't speak Punjabi, right? And yet, a young person or Somali or even a convert of Jamaican or English or other extraction can find himself feeling really desperate at the state of affairs around the world. And that's wherever you look. Now, if today you chose to look at Syria, or you chose to look, for example, in the Central African Republic, or if you chose to look in Yemen, or in other parts of the Middle East, if you look in Egypt, Muslim on Muslim violence, then you get people can become very angry, very embittered, and feel like we need to do something. And the other thing about our generation, of course, is we are the microwave pizza, the instant coffee generation. We ping and the world has to know about it. We need answers yesterday. Isn't that true? So you don't wait. There's no patience. There's no things. The Prophet, it took him 12 years before there's any mention, any idea of being allowed to now take up a sword. 12 years of suffering, of experiencing and witnessing helplessly. The Prophet would walk past, I mentioned to you Sumayya, the first woman, the first human being in this religious tradition to be killed for her faith was a woman. Her name was Sumayya. She was an elderly woman. She, her husband, her son, Ammar, his father Yasir, his mother Sumayya, would be brutalized on a daily basis because they were poor, they were without the backing, tribal backing to protect themselves, and they'd become Muslim, and mercilessly they were set upon. They were whipped, they were beaten, they were... In the end, she was killed when one of her persecutors, he plunged his spear into her. And she dies, an old woman. And the Prophet would witness the suffering and the pain of these people. And he'd walk past them and he'd say, Sabran ala Yasir, O house of Yasir, be patient, be firm. فَإِنَّ مَوْعِدَكُمُ الْحَوْض. And I promise to you that I will meet you again, if not in this world, in the next. I will meet you before God. And your injuries and your suffering will be requited. But be patient here today. So Islam had this sense of patience. One of the other things that's really central to jihad, when it finally came, is that in Islam we have this concept of really not believing in a separation of church and state. And I'm not talking about politically and secularism and versus democracy, a theocracy. I'm speaking about the idea that people often say, why do you pray in the very particular way that you pray? Can't you just sit in a quiet corner and do a bit of meditation or praising God in your own way? What's with the whole? It's very, very, very sort of ritualized, isn't it? We have to wash, and we have to wash in a certain way, and then we have to stand facing a certain direction, and then it's, there's a certain order and number of units, and and Muslims know about this, and it's. And sometimes you watch these things on television, don't you, or film, where they're depicting Muslims, and you always know when it's not been done with any advice from a Muslim, right? Because they're all bowing at the wrong time and they're like having a conversation and doing a sujood. We know it doesn't work like that, right? We know it's very, very ritualized. So what's with the whole form? What's with the physicality? Well, the answer to that is partly because we believe it is as God created us, mind, body and soul, that we turn to Him, mind, body and soul. We don't just worship Him with our eyes closed. Although the Prophet said, "Ad-du'a'u mukhul ibadah," the prayer, not the physical ritual prayer, but the invocation, the words that you whisper to God, that is the essence of worship. Ad-du'a mukhul ibadah. Dua, we call that dua. And you can make a dua and you're like, no one can tell you're calling unto Him. There's a hadith Imam Ahmad narrates, and he says, the most keenly listened to voice, the voice that God listens to most keenly, is the solitary voice that calls out His name, whilst all around it are talking about other things, are thinking about other things. So everyone's thinking about like what's happening on EastEnders, or who's going to do the voice. Is the voice still on? Still on, so who's going to win the voice? And people are talking about, and amongst all of that, there's one person saying, La ilaha illallah wahda. There is none worthy of worship, adoration, of glorifying, but God alone, mighty, majestic, high, above the heavens and the earth. And there is someone who's thinking of Him, and that is a voice from a sea of voices that is keenly listened to. But we worship God, mind, body and soul. And in that sense, we don't believe in a separation of church and state. We don't believe in a separation of... And therefore, jihad then is not just something about weapons and a battlefield and an enemy, and you fight. It is, before it is anything that engages with another person, it is something that we have to engage with spiritually. Muslims once upon a time knew this. The Prophet Muhammad, the first battle they fought was called the Battle of Badr. It took place 19 months after the Prophet had left Mecca and migrated to Medina. And they were being pursued and pursued and pursued. And then within 19 months, the Meccans turned up to destroy this fledgling community before it had time to take root. Because they knew if this whole thing about worshipping one God alone and turning your back on idols spreads, if this catches on in Arabia, we've lost our monopoly over the religious, the spiritual heartlands of Arabia, which in the end wasn't necessarily the case. But people were afraid of things like this. Who's going to come to our temples and our idols, and all the pilgrims who come and do all of these things will stop if people stop worshipping idols. They came within 90 months. The Prophet met an army of 1,000 with 313 men. They had literally, and this is historically documented, they had something like 7 horses, 7 men on horseback to face this army of 1,000. The majority of the people were on foot. Not everybody had a sword, not everybody had arrows. And the Prophet spent that whole night, the night before the Battle of Badr, making dua, making this call. And all he'd say again and again, Allahumma in tahlik hadhihi al-isaba falan tu'bad ba'da al-yawm. Lord, if today this small band of men is allowed to be destroyed, who will worship you in this land again? Who will worship you in this land again? And then they meet and they go to battle, and history records a truly remarkable thing happens. This tiny community that should have been wiped, obliterated off the face of the earth, is victorious. The army that's 1,000 strong is defeated. 70 of its members are taken captive. 70 fall in battle, die, and the rest retreat. And the people of Badr, the 313 who stood with the Prophet and took part in this battle, they can't believe their luck. And then a couple of years later, the same thing happens. This time it's Uhud. And in the battle of and Uhud is, anyone who's been to Medina knows, Uhud, the mount of Uhud is literally within, you can see the mount of Uhud from the Prophet's mosque. You can see the mount of Uhud. and the enemy had become this close to taking